As we continue our exploration and overview of the history of typography, we'll take a look at some of the different printing methods that were used. And engraving was one of them. Engraving is still used today as a printmaking technique, but it was used more widely back in the late 15 or mid to late 1500s. And as you can see from the diagram here, a metal plate is incised or scratched into with sharp tools to create indentations into which the ink is rubbed, and then when the paper is pressed onto it in a press, the ink is then transferred onto the paper. And these illuminated capital letters are examples of engraving. It's a very delicate and can be a very beautiful way of creating both letter forms and imagery. Not as widely used today, but again, it is still a respected form of fine art printmaking. This style is called Rococo. It is a fairly decorative way of embellishing letter forms, and Rococo relies a lot on organic imagery and fleur-de-lis and curves and just a really kind of over-the-top element of decor. And they've done a fairly good job at keeping things legible here, but a Rococo letter form or any type of Rococo design is very dramatic and embellished and very busy and somewhat over the top with the elegance and the busyness of it. Skipping ahead to the mid-1700s, here's an example of the Baskerville typeface. And Baskerville is a name that you might be familiar with because you might have it on your computers, a digital form of the typeface that John Baskerville designed again in the mid-1700s. And it's a really readable typeface. It's really rounded. The thicks and thins are nicely designed. And it's an example of what's called the transitional classification. In a later video, I will be talking about type classifications and different fonts that fall into those categories, and this Baskerville is an example of the transitional typeface. Here's an example of what's called, or what was called, the modern classification. It's not very modern to us, it's 1784, but Giambattista Bodoni in Italy designed this beautiful face, and it was at the time a real groundbreaker because it was very dramatically different with the thicks and thins. It has a real vertical stress to the letter forms, and you can recognize that it's different and a little more dramatically designed than the others we've seen. And at the time it was released, it must have been a real groundbreaker, hence the classification of modern. Going back to another form of printing, this is an example of a lithography stone. Lithography is a printing method which was very popular in the 1800s, utilizing a stone plate and oil-based inks, and it is again used today as a fine art printing method, although not used for typography anymore. But here's an example of the incisions into the stone that are backwards, and of course when printed they come out correctly. Lithography became extremely popular in the 1800s, in addition to typography printing, but also for color printing. And here are some examples of Victorian boxes, also advertising and printing on paper, were done with the lithography style. And it allowed for multi-plate printing and a lot of different color applications. So it was the state-of-the-art way of printing back in the 1800s. Here's an example of a Victorian poster, or broadside as they were sometimes known, and this is a very distinctive style for the Victorian era because you'll notice that the layout is not very interesting. It's just justified text, straight columns, no imagery, no color, very simple layout here, but what makes this interesting is the use of different fonts, different sizing, and different styles to call your attention to the words that they want to emphasize. And this was how people communicated, but certainly before radio and television, they used these broadsides to either advertise a product or an event or a news item. And it really relies, this style really relies on the fonts themselves and the different styles and sizing of the fonts. So this is a really distinctive style for the Victorian era. This is an example of what a newspaper would have looked like in the early 1800s. There is, as you can see, some care taken for readability with the leading in between the lines in the body copy, but for some reason the the spacing of the subtitle is really very poor. I think they still are developing their readability chops here, and so while some of it is easy to read, a lot of it still isn't. So they're developing, they're getting there. Other inventions or developments, I should say, of letter forms show up in examples like this word furniture, where the deep drop solid creates a somewhat 3D effect. And this is where again, is early 1800s. And effects like this start to take typography into a dramatic and kind of visual feeling. And again, when this sort of look first came out, this must have been somewhat dramatic and groundbreaking for the way the type was treated. Now, this is a really important period in typography history. This is around 1816, early 1800s. This is the first example that we know of the sans serif letter forms, and this is without the little feet at the end of the letters. And William Caslon, who is a type designer, designed this letter form for utilitarian use. This was not initially designed for public viewing. Okay, the letters were considered very straightforward, they weren't very decorative, they weren't very interesting, and this form of type was used just for business use or utilitarian labeling and things like that. But of course, as we know, the sans serif look has extremely taken off, and now it comprises a lot, if not most, of what we see on screen today. So this is again early 1800s, and William Caslon developed this sans serif look, which has been extremely popular nowadays. And that's where it all started. This photo shows examples of wooden letter forms that are inked and printed, and a lot of times the letter forms, the styles were made from metal, but when the letters started to get really large, it was found that wood was easier to work with. So a lot of the larger letter forms were carved out of wood, and you can see the beautiful intricate wood carving that really makes these works of art in their own right. The rest of the slides in this video, for the most part, are going to show different styles of design. This is an example of Victoriana, again 1830s, early 1800s, a lot of emphasis on visuals and imagery, not so much emphasis on type. Actually, it's hard to read that word on the top there. Really the emphasis was on the printing style and the imagery and the real busy borders that Victoriana embodies. Here's a picture of a typecasting machine, the early typesetting machines. This would have been state-of-the-art, 1838, and you can see the keyboard there, and these machines developed into typesetting machines that were popular and used up until the late 20th century. Of course, now everything is digital. And here's examples of the earliest typewriter letters, and you can see the spacing is still not quite there, but the letter forms are starting to develop and they're starting to look more recognizable to what we know today. Here's an example of the arts and crafts movement. This was a design movement that was popular in the late 1800s. It began in England and then came over to the States in the early 20th century. And it's an example of very simplified typography, but with the fairly fancy imagery surrounding it, very based on Art Nouveau. And here's an example of Art Nouveau. Beautiful organic letter forms, very plant-like forms, a lot of flowing type and imagery. Art Nouveau is a popular style. We still see examples of posters nowadays. In contrast, in very stark contrast here, we have something called Expressionism. And this was the early 20th century, 1905. And this has a real German or Russian expression feel to it. Very dramatic, very stark, not interested in physical beauty at all. Now, in 1905, we're on the eve of World War I. In Europe, there was a lot of unrest, there was a lot of political turmoil, and here's a great example of that turmoil and ill-ease being seen in the way the typography is treated. It's a very successful expressionistic piece here. As time went on and World War I became closer and more imminent, we started seeing things like propaganda posters. This one on the right here, which I believe says Luftschutz, which means air protection, is a propaganda poster that has the swastika on it, and it's kind of a pro-military poster with the man looking to the sky, talking about air raids and the importance of protecting our country with airstrikes. So it's kind of, now that we know, of course, history, it has a dark feeling to it, but typography was being used in a real dramatic way as early as the early 20th century. So as we move forward into the final video for type history, you'll see how type developed from this era on up into today's contemporary treatments.